Do you ever wonder what the end is really going to be like? I think so many Christians are fascinated with what has often been deemed as the end times, the last days on up to Jesus Christ's return. But there really is a lot of debate concerning that end time period. And one of the debates that continues to march on is the debate concerning the millennial time. What is the millennium look like? When will the millennium take place? And we're going to do our best to answer that question today. Stay tuned. Well, the word millennium means 1,000. The term comes from Revelation 20 verses 4 and 5, where the Apostle John writes this: I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the Word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Well, throughout the history of the church, there have been three major views on the time and the nature of the millennium. The first view is what theologians call amillennial. It's a very common view in England, for example, and Australia, and it's even picking up steam in the United States, as far as I can gather. Well, this view has been very common throughout the history of the church. So you can't really come along and suggest that this is some new view or that genuine Christians don't hold this view. They certainly do. The vast majority of Lutherans and Calvinists and all kinds of different Baptists have held this view. I have Southern Baptist friends today that hold this view. It was first systematized in the 4th century by the great theologian Augustine. So according to this position, the passage in Revelation 20 that we've just read describes the present church age between the first and the second comings of Jesus Christ. So this view holds that Christians are living in the millennium now. So under this view, during this millennium, Satan's influence over the nations has been greatly reduced. And because of the fact that Satan is limited in his power and in his influence, currently the gospel is able to spread all over the world. And the Christians that are reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, according to Revelation 20, that is during the millennium, are Christians that have already died and are reigning in heaven with Christ now. So Christ's reign in the 1,000 years then is to be understood not as a bodily reign here on earth, but rather a heavenly reign. Now this view is called amillennial because it holds that there's no future millennium to come. A in Greek means not or no. So amillennial means there is no millennium. But that in a sense is not really fair to the view. I mean, what it says is that there's no millennium after Christ returns. It's not that there isn't a millennium. It's not that there isn't a 1,000 years. It's that the millennium in this view is currently happening now in this present church age. Another important note is that because the book of Revelation is filled with a demonstrable amount of symbolism, the amillennial position usually interprets 1,000 years as symbolic, and it's symbolic for a long period of time. Now, according to this view, the present church age will continue until the time of Christ's return. And then when Jesus' second coming finally happens, there will be a resurrection of both believers and unbelievers. The bodies of believers will rise to be united with their spirits, and will enter into full enjoyment of heaven forever. Unbelievers will be raised to face final judgment and eternal condemnation. And at this time, the new heaven and the new earth will begin. And immediately after the final judgment, the eternal state will commence and continue forever. When I say eternal state, that means the time in which Christ's purposes and plans are brought to realization will come, and we will live eternally with Him forever. The second view is called postmillennialism. The prefix post means after. So in this view, Christ will return after the millennium. So postmillennialists believe that the millennium has begun in some sense now. That the millennium will come when the world has been fully Christianized. So you see, according to this view, the progress of the gospel then and the growth of the church will gradually increase so that a larger and larger proportion of the world's population will be Christians. So under this view, the gospel is absolutely booming. And as a result, society is going to function more and more according to God's standards. And gradually what's going to happen is a millennial splendor will come. An age of peace and righteousness will occur here on earth. Now, like amillennialism, the 1,000 years doesn't mean a literal 1,000 years, but it is symbolic for a long period of time. Now finally, at the end of this period, Christ will return to earth. Believers and unbelievers will be raised, the final judgment will occur, and there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and we will then enter into the eternal state. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, how in the world could things get better? I mean, there's so much evil, so much suffering. It really is hard to hold a view like this during this time period of history. But a post-mill advocate will say, yes, things are bad, but they're changing. I mean, there have been more Christian converts in the last 200 years than the first 1800 years of the church combined. They'll make that argument. The third view is called dispensational, pre-tribulational, premillennialism. That's a mouthful, I know. Dispensationalism simply refers to the fact that God has arranged his administration concerning this world in a number of periods during which he does things a little bit differently. Now, all Christians are dispensationalists in some sense because none of us Christians are making sacrifices to the Lord on Mount Moriah. So we all think that there are some changes in God's dealings with the human race from the old covenant to the new. But dispensationalism in this context is most commonly tied to the view that there are 7 dispensations in history in which God deals with his people in different ways. Now, there's not a whole lot of time to get into that belief right now. We're going off topic a bit. But this view is called pre-tribulational because Christ comes back part way before the tribulation and gathers believers to himself. It's called premillennialism because Christ's second coming, not the part way coming, but the second coming, happens before the millennium. So under this view, the church age that we are in now will continue until suddenly and unexpectedly and secretly Christ will return partway to the earth. He will call believers to himself. He will rapture them out of the way. The term rapture, I'm sure you've heard of it. It means to snatch away. The church is snatched away. And Christ will return back to heaven with the church. And the resurrection of the righteous happens at this moment in time. So when that happens, there will be a great tribulation on the earth for 7 years, 7 literal years. And at the end of the tribulation, Christ will come back with the saints to reign on earth for 1,000 years. So the millennium will begin here on earth. And then there will come the resurrection of the unbelievers, the last judgment, the beginning of the new heaven and the new earth and the eternal state. Now this end-time scheme, I'm sure you may know this, but it's represented by the Left Behind series. And I suppose I could be wrong, but I don't think you find this as a system full-blown till about 1830 with Pastor John Nelson Darby. The third view, we're going to call it 3B, is historic premillennialism. So notice that in this view, you don't find the word dispensationalism. This view doesn't really break up things so clearly into 7 dispensations. The lines aren't clear enough, they argue. You do acknowledge, of course, that God works differently with his people at times in history, but this view doesn't highlight that there are 7 major periods of distinction. So the view is called historic because as a system you can actually trace it all the way back to the early church. So what is understood here is that Christ comes and the Holy Spirit is given at Pentecost in Acts 2, and the kingdom is dawning. So it's not here in its fullness, but it is dawning. It's here in some sense. Then, towards the end of this present church age, you have a period of great tribulation. But the numbers 7 and 3.5 are understood symbolically for a period of sustained tribulation. The point is that there is a great tribulation that happens before Christ's second coming. And in this view, Christians actually go through that tribulation. So unlike the view that we just mentioned, where the church is snatched away and they don't have to go through the Great Tribulation, under this view, Christians go through the Great Tribulation. And after the tribulation, Christ will return to earth and establish a millennial kingdom. Now this view maintains that there is only one return of Christ, and at his return, believers, both those who have already died and those that are still alive, will rise to meet him in the air as he descends. Now it's called post-tribulation because it locates the rapture at the end of the tribulation. So those who affirm this view reject the notion of this kind of two-stage return or separate secret return of Christ prior to the tribulation. So under this view, believers will reign with Christ on earth for 1,000 years. Now most historic premillennialists take the 1,000 years to be a symbolic expression that means a long period of time. And at the beginning of this time, Satan will be bound for the entire millennium. At the end of the millennium, Satan will be let loose after a long period of time, and he will attempt to defeat Christ, but he will lose. Then if you keep going, all unbelievers that have died throughout history will be raised, and they will stand before Jesus for the final judgment. And after the final judgment, believers will enter into the eternal state. Now, I've not explained everything about these views, all the footnotes that could be said. I've not explained what goes on in the millennium in great detail. What I have done, though, is very briefly given you a general understanding of the views. And if it does seem confusing to you, it is a bit confusing, and there's a lot of information to take in, and if you've not heard any of these categories, I imagine you could be confused. But one thing that all these views hold in common is that Christ will return and he will reign. And he will end the suffering and sorrow. And in each view, Christ wins. And that's what matters the most. Well, thank you so much. God bless you in the way.